On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany unleashed the great technological advances of the 20th century in a withering attack on neighboring Poland. What followed was the most devastating conflict in human history as men and women from virtually every nation on earth engaged in the bitter struggle that was World War II. For 6 long years, the fate of our world rose and fell, delicately poised on a knife edge of key events, victories and losses, mistakes and heroics. This is the story of that knife edge, the turning points that shaped mankind's greatest watershed, taking both sides within sight of victory. The war to end all wars had left Europe deeply scarred. Mighty empires collapsed, old countries were abolished, and new ones were formed. Even before it was over, Germany was gripped by civil conflict, losing its Kaiser as a result. Meanwhile, Japan, rapidly developing and emboldened by its victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, had begun to dream of empire. It is clear now that the storm clouds of World War II were gathering long before World War I had ended. We remember that the First World War laid waste to huge parts of France and Belgium. But in the forgotten areas of the Balkans and East Prussia, hundreds of large towns and small villages also lay in ruins. Poverty, homelessness, and hunger gripped Europe, and with it came social unrest. The first challenge for European leaders in peacetime was to deal with the humanitarian crisis gripping the continent as it plunged into its first winter in the shadow of mankind's greatest tragedy. Of course, the war is over. And by the war being over, I mean an end to that static industrialized carnage that's torn Europe apart for over 4 years. The war might be over, but the reality of it is that the violence continues. What's happened, in fact, is that the violence is accelerating and it's decentralizing as well. And so, what they were dealing with in 1919 was trying to come to terms with the really catastrophe of the First World War and trying to bring something out of it, trying to bring order, trying to feed people who were starving across Europe, trying to restore some semblance of government in large parts of the center of Europe, trying to avert another catastrophe like the one they just come through. The loss of the Kaiser had seen the once great German Empire shatter, and the remaining states were left floundering, riven by political instability. In an attempt to bring order and to quell the overwhelming anger that had been a hallmark of public discourse since the armistice of November 1918, the victorious powers of France, Britain, and the United States along with their allies called Germany and her allies to account at the Paris Peace Conference conducted over 6 months in the opulent surrounds of the Palace of Versailles. A conference that Germany, beset by famine and political turmoil, attended in May 1919 with high hopes of a positive outcome. They really think that they will be on a par with the other powers and that if anything they can blame it more on Austria-Hungary, hope that Austria-Hungary as the initial site in which the hostilities erupted will be taken the blame. But then it turns out that no, actually they're not calling the shots. They can't determine even the terms of the conversations, and the terms of those conversations were devastating. The map of Europe and in particular the map of Germany was totally redrawn. Gone was also agriculturally rich, and the Huken district Poznana and parts of West Prussia and coal-rich Upper Silesia became the new independent state of Poland, and the heavily industrialized Salon came under French control. Her colonies in Africa and Asia were divided amongst the victors, and a further burden on an economy already devastated by the war was imposed in the form of reparations. The Germans are forced to acknowledge Clause 231 and 232 of the Versailles Treaty, and those clauses acknowledge very explicitly Germany's responsibility for the war. The Allies assert that Germany alone, the Central Powers alone, are responsible for the war and therefore Germany must pay for it. Forced to admit her guilt as the nation that started the war, Germany held its breath as a number of figures were mooted, from $23 billion to $2 billion. Finally, $6 billion was settled on, an amount that enraged Germans felt was too high and disgusted French saw as too little. In the end, all that emerged from Versailles was false hope coupled with dissatisfaction, a profound sense of unfinished business. What you have here is a vision for a fairer and more equitable social order. And what you have, I think, very much is a sense that if you want to avoid war, you really need to have social justice. And I guess most tragically of all, what we see is a failure to deliver on that moment of vision. It's, if you like, a stillborn hope, a dawn that never truly comes to fruition. At Versailles, Germany had been treated as if it had lost the war. But as far as many Germans were concerned, there was no defeat. The war had not ended in a surrender, but an armistice. And the fact that their army had marched home bearing arms was proof. And so, in the minds of many, not only were the terms of the Treaty of Versailles an injustice, but their acceptance was a betrayal. As the Western Front then began to collapse, particularly through October and November 1918, German senior figures began plotting how they could excuse themselves from this debacle. And the excuse they generated was that the army had not failed. It had not been defeated. It had still been fighting to the last moment. But weak liberal politicians at home and a traitorous working class inspired by communist ideals and possibly funded by Jews had somehow stabbed the army in the back. It was this powerful mythology of the Jews and the Bolsheviks working together coupled with a nostalgia for the all-powerful German Empire that became the driving force behind the rise of Adolf Hitler. A rise that began with his ascent to the leadership of the German Workers' Party and a failed coup, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923. Within 2 days he was arrested, tried for treason and sentenced to 14 years in jail. After serving 9 months, he was released by a sympathetic judiciary to a newfound notoriety. His supporters in the country began to feel that he was the one who acted. Hitler's the man who did the job. He failed, but he tried. The Weimar Republic that had replaced imperial rule in Germany after World War I was a bold experiment in democracy, blighted by a constant cycle of electioneering. A low electoral qualification cutoff meant that numerous parties were elected to the Reich, making it almost impossible to form majority government. As a result, the terms of office were often cut frustratingly short by the dissolution of coalitions. Sitting above the chaos of the parliament with powers to appoint and dismiss chancellors was the reassuring figure of the president. And as Germany reeled from the effects of the Great Depression in 1929, that office was held by the World War I hero and patriarch, General Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg's political goal all along had been he wanted to orient Germany much more to the right and away from the democracy that had taken hold in 1918–1919. For this, he wanted a stable right-wing authoritarian government that had substantial backing among the people, among the population. A sense of public frustration with democracy, growing anti-Semitism, and a devastated economy saw Hitler's ultra-right-wing Nazi Party secure 30% of the vote in the elections of 1930. The chaos continued, and in July 1932 a fearful and exasperated electorate increased that to 35%, which led an emboldened Hitler to challenge for the presidency. He failed. But with support growing for the communist left and no clear man of the people on the conservative right, the eyes of the ruling Social Democrats began to turn in his direction. They were frightened that if Hitler was not appointed, then the left would take over. Right-wing conservatives just did not have a mass base. They had no mass support. Whereas of course the left had very substantial mass support, and the only support which the right might be able to have was the Nazis. After no clear majority emerged from yet another round of elections in November 1932, the former Chancellor Franz von Papen and a number of the country's most powerful industrialists, aristocrats, and military men joined forces to convince Hindenburg that he should appoint Hitler as Chancellor, rather foolishly believing that they could control him. Hindenburg agreed. So when Hitler becomes Chancellor, he's in a coalition government where there are only 2 other Nazis in a cabinet of 11 people. And the other people in his cabinet are the kinds of traditional elite figures, and they're the kinds of men who are confident they can deal with Hitler. But within 2 months, Hitler proposed and passed the Enabling Act, the law that would give him the freedom to act without parliamentary consent. Non-Nazi parties were formally outlawed in July 1933. Finally, with Hindenburg's death in August 1934, he achieved full dictatorial power by combining the positions of Chancellor and President. In doing so, he had realized both his and Hindenburg's dream, an end to the weakness of democracy and a return to the power of authoritarianism. A dream that would have unimaginable global consequences. There's no one else who would have driven Germany into at least quite the war that happened. And there's almost certainly no one else who would have driven Germany into committing the genocide against European Jews that Germany did under his rule. If you take those things out of 20th century history, you have fundamentally changed the historical record of the 20th century. So I think that's where the importance of this man really lies. Opportunity. And this is something that Göring was very interested in as well. Hermann Göring would testify at the Nuremberg trials that he had indeed urged Hitler to support Franco under all circumstances in order to test weaponry. And one of the greatest tests would be of the Luftwaffe, who in April 1937 were given the task of reducing the beautiful Basque city of Jarnac to ruins. A raid that would validate the growing international fear of air attack. A fear which accurately anticipated that in a future war, the aerial forces of warring nations would be able to wipe whole cities and their civilian inhabitants off the map. The Luftwaffe using new carpet bombing techniques succeeded admirably. As far as Hitler was concerned, it was all good. His participation in the Spanish Civil War had been immensely beneficial. They'd managed to trial a number of military tactics which would be used in the Blitzkrieg in Poland first and then in France. A lot of military equipment had been tried and tested in Spain. So for Hitler, the consequences were positive. And with his armed forces growing in experience, Hitler's training ground had proved a success and would set the scene for a much larger conflict. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just cause dissent in Europe. In the East, Japan began to dream of empire. What emerged since the Meiji Restoration in 1868 was a desire for wealth, power, and prestige as a way of redressing the inequality that had been placed upon the country by Western powers in the past. And when those Western nations failed to agree to a racial equality clause in the Treaty of Versailles, it opened all wounds. Is the great slight that is felt by the Japanese people, and McKenna talks about this very openly at the conference. This is an insult to so much of the human race. This is an affront to our humanity. They have seen that they are the equal of whites in war. And yet what they have now is the whites trying to reassert this old colonial world order. It's something that informs Japan's desire to create a new world order in Asia that it will in fact lead. Meanwhile, China was developing its own sense of national identity. So that growing sense, particularly amongst the elites, that China really was a nation-state in its own right became stronger and stronger. But that feeling came up against a growing force in Japan of imperialism. When the Japanese Kwan army first invaded Manchuria on the 18th of September, 1931, it set off a destructive chain of events. The Manchurian crisis ended with the dramatic walkout of Japanese delegates. Japan, however, found it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly and the country's subsequent withdrawal from the League of Nations in 1933 when the West upheld China's appeal against Japanese aggression, leaving Japan increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. And so these two implacable forces came up against each other. And the trigger for the war between them turned out to be this rather small-scale and certainly not pre-planned shooting just outside Beijing on the 7th of July, 1937. Under agreements going back to the beginning of the century, countries with delegations in China had the right to keep troops there in modest numbers for protection. Under the cover of these agreements, Japan had spent the previous 5 years gradually seizing ever larger sections of northern and eastern China, slowly encircling Beijing. Amongst them were small numbers stationed near what in the West was referred to as the Marco Polo Bridge outside the city of Wanping. A modern construction that was the only road and rail link between Beijing and the Chinese nationalist stronghold in Nanjing. What happened that July night is not entirely clear, but Japanese troops were carrying out training exercises without having given the customary notice to Chinese authorities. Shots were fired by startled Chinese troops, and one of these Japanese soldiers had gone missing, and the Japanese local commander demands to go into the war cities to investigate, and the local commander refused. When the Chinese insisted on doing the searching themselves, the Japanese infantry then tried to force their way into the walled city. While various attempts were made to settle the dispute, the incident only served to give Japanese military hawks the excuse they needed to mount a full-scale invasion. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were dispatched. Beijing and Shanghai quickly fell, as did Nanjing, under the weight of modern Japanese firepower. The Japanese had a huge advantage in terms of mechanized divisions, in terms of artillery, and particularly in terms of air power. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese really didn't have any air support that was significant in the early days of the war. By the end of 1938, much of northern and eastern China had been overrun, including the eastern seaboard, and Japan's relations with the democratic powers rapidly deteriorated. With U.S. oil embargoes in place, Japan's eyes began to look to South Asia. And with that, the slogan that once read, Asia for Asians, quickly transformed into the far more menacing, Asia for the Japanese. Japan would have its empire, no matter the cost. Japan was not the only country focusing on expansionism. By 1938, Hitler's determination for an annulus or reunification of Germany with his homeland of Austria was a cornerstone of his ideology from his early days as a fledgling politician in Munich. In a 1921 essay he wrote, "The Reich has a single task of incorporating the 10 million German Austrians in the empire and dethroning the Habsburgs, the most miserable dynasty ever ruined." And having assumed full control of Germany on Hindenburg's death, he had boldly and yet diplomatically worked towards that goal, rebuilding much of the German peacemaking empire that had been ripped away by Versailles. But of course, the Versailles Treaty was built on the premise that Germany should be punished and should be prevented from becoming a major power again in the future. That's why Austria became an independent country separate from Germany. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, an agreement about the reparations, the SAR, and this is the first stage of successes if you like. These are the soft issues of the Versailles settlement been pulled off and thrown away. I think the transition point is the union with Austria. But the Treaty of Saint-Germain and the Treaty of Versailles both strictly forbade that union. Many Germans and Austrians favored it. But Hitler was aware that he could not be seen to be acting with force. Thankfully, he had an ally within Austria itself, the Austrian Nazi Party. Initially, the Anschluss push for incorporation into Germany came from the Austrian Nazis themselves. It wasn't initiated by Hitler, and he was concerned at first because he thought they played their hand too soon. He doesn't support the Nazis in Austria for a couple of years. He lets them go ahead, but he doesn't give their formal approval until he sees that the takeover is possible. And then of course he gives full backing to it. He ordered the Austrian Nazi Party to create as much unrest as possible. Riots were initiated, buildings torched. To quell that unrest, the Austrian government of Kurt Schuschnigg banned all Nazi activity. Hitler then called a meeting with the Austrian leader during which he pointedly threatened to invade Austria unless Schuschnigg agreed to a soft unification and to give key positions in his government to Nazis. Schuschnigg tried to buy time by appointing the Nazi Seyss Inquart as Minister of the Interior. On March 9, 1938, Schuschnigg announced his intention to hold a plebiscite to allow the Austrian people to decide for themselves about a union. An enraged Hitler responded by moving his troops to the Austrian border and demanding that Schuschnigg call off the referendum. With Britain and France remaining idle, Schuschnigg, under immense pressure to avoid bloodshed, had no choice but to resign. Immediately, Seyss Inquart took his place and asked Hitler to send the German army into Austria to help restore order. Hitler was now able to enter Austria on the 13th of March by invitation. So when the German army moves in, there is no Austrian resistance. In fact, they're embraced by some of the Austrian contingents. And the church in Austria too, the Archbishop for example in Vienna gives his full support to the Nazi takeover. It's very difficult to be opposed when the Austrians themselves appeared by all measurement. The authorities like the church were on the side of Hitler and the Nazis. Very difficult to oppose it. To shore up the union and legitimize it in the eyes of the rest of the world, Hitler announced a plebiscite for April 10, 1938. And the results were overwhelming. It was 90% of Austrians who wanted it. Now these figures can be challenged. How do you measure it? But insofar as they are a measurement of public opinion, they are worth considering. And it wasn't imposed simply by bullying. It seemed he did catch the mood of the people. And certainly down to 38, you could say he judged correctly. He got what he wanted. And it's what the people wanted too, it appeared. And with the unification, the Treaty of Versailles along with the much vaunted League of Nations lay in tatters. On a world stage, Hitler had the reinforcement that he could take the land he wanted. Hitler's annexation of Austria did not go unnoticed by Western powers. When the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the House of Commons on March 14, he commented that the hard fact is that nothing could have arrested what has actually happened in Austria unless this country and other countries had been prepared to use force. His sentiments echoing the thoughts of the many who had suffered just 20 years earlier. Britain had experienced the First World War. There was this huge peace movement in Britain and people were obviously frightened of war. But at the same time there was a point at which I think they realized that appeasement was not working. A little over a month after the Austrian plebiscite it became clear that Hitler had set his sights on the annexation of the German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia. And it also became clear that this time he was prepared to use force. Czechoslovakia was a different kind of thing. It had been an experiment actually because it wasn't a nation-state. It was a union, a voluntary union between two ethnic groups that didn't exist as states before into this Czechoslovakia. So there was a problem. The problem was that there was quite a sizable German-speaking and German-feeling minority in the west of the country in an area that was called Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was an industrially rich area that had been removed from Germany at Versailles. Hitler's rhetoric was directed at the 3.5 million Germans who are being suppressed in this state. But in truth, what he coveted was the area's industrial capacity to fuel his ever-burgeoning war machine. In mid-September, Chamberlain, desperate to avoid a conflict at any cost, met Hitler at his retreat in Burgkarten. At that meeting, Hitler agreed to take no military action without further consultation. And Chamberlain agreed to try to persuade his cabinet and the French to accept the results of a proposed plebiscite in the Sudetenland. But Hitler also left Chamberlain in no doubt that he would act if no agreement was reached. The Munich crisis was a turning point. It marked that shift towards a far more aggressive foreign policy, far more unilateral foreign policy, far more risky foreign policy, and a foreign policy that was no longer averse to using military threat and potentially military power to achieve its goals. Chamberlain returned home with assurances that Hitler could be appeased. The French Premier Edward Daladier and his Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet then went to London where a joint proposal was prepared stipulating that all areas with a population that was more than 50% sedate German be turned over to Germany in keeping with the tenets of self-determination outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. Czechoslovakia was in the main a non-German state but the Sudetenland around it was very pro-German. So the return of the Sudetenland to Germany it made sense in terms of the Versailles Treaty we work on self-determination. So all Hitler's claims for a return of territories and peoples had a legal justification to them, which is why he couldn't believe that France and Britain would actually fight. When Chamberlain returned to Germany on September 22, Hitler, perceiving the reluctance of the British and French to engage in conflict, stiffened his demands. He now wanted the Sudetenland occupied by the German army and the Czechoslovakians evacuated from the area by September 28. In a last-minute effort to avoid war, Chamberlain proposed a four-power conference to settle the dispute. Hitler agreed. And on September 29, Hitler, Chamberlain, Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini met in Munich, where Mussolini introduced a written plan. The German army was to complete an occupation of the Sudetenland by October 10, and an international commission would decide the future of other disputed areas. The Munich Agreement was accepted by all. I think Munich is about buying time to a large extent. It's about not being ready to fight and it's about exploring options, although they're ever-decreasing options. We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. Chamberlain returned to Britain to a hero's welcome, waving the signed agreement above his head. But his claim of peace in our time was to prove hopelessly optimistic. Up until 38, Hitler had spoken of peace a lot. His his speeches mentioned peace. But after Munich, he hauled the various editors of newspapers into a big meeting and said, "Right, from now onwards, we've been talking peace. Now, we've got to prepare the German population for war." In March 1939, emboldened by his earlier successes, Hitler, in breach of the written guarantee that he had issued to Chamberlain in Munich in 1938, ordered the German occupation of the whole of Czechoslovakia, setting the scene for his plans to come in response to Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain issued a formal guarantee of the borders of the newly created independent state of Poland, adding that he expected Hitler to moderate his demands. Within days, an undeterred Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for the invasion of Poland, setting the date as September 1st. Everyone, including his generals, was urging caution. The trouble is Poland was ripe. It had no natural defensive barriers. Its armed forces were in a state of great weakness. He was furious with the Poles because they'd refused to negotiate a realignment of territory to again change the verdict of Versailles, giving German territory back. He was very angry, and he also needed to go through Poland to achieve the final consummation, which was the attack on Russia. What drove Hitler on was a belief that both Neville Chamberlain and the French Premier Edward Dellier would opt for a peace settlement rather than war. And he had ample evidence to support that theory. Britain and France had both accepted German rearmament in 1935. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the Annales of March 1938, and in September they had endorsed the forced transfer of the ethnically German Sudeten from Czechoslovakia, then stood by as Czechoslovakia had been invaded. All acts in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles that had garnered not inconsiderable support from a Western public. Many of whom believed the treaty was flawed and feared communism more than fascism. The way he sells the war in 1939 is much as it has been sold prior to 1938. A demand to restore German territory, and in this case the isolated part of Germany, East Prussia cut off by the so-called Polish corridor from the rest of Germany, is the casus belli for invading Poland. The need to go and free these Germans who are trapped in Polish territory, the need to restore Greater Germany. On August the 11th, he foreshadowed what he had been planning when he told the League of Nations High Commissioner, "If there's the slightest provocation, I shall shatter Poland without warning into so many pieces that there will be nothing left to pick up." He then set about creating that provocation. Fake border incidents were organized by the Gestapo, who after scouting the border between Germany and Poland to find relatively isolated outposts of the German government that could be attacked by Polish aggressors, settled on an area near the town of Glevens. The attacks would be on a forestry station, a customs house, and a radio station. And the propaganda ministry under Goebbels went to work. Basically what Goebbels had to do was to try and show that, everybody else was to blame. The Poles were to blame. The Brits were to blame for trying to encircle Germany again. At 6 a.m. on the 1st of September, the Polish capital, Warsaw, was struck without warning by the first of a succession of bombing raids. At the same time, two major German army groups invaded Poland from Prussia in the north and Slovakia in the south. Most of Poland's air force was caught and destroyed on the ground as Panzer spearheads smashed holes in the Polish lines, allowing the slower-moving German infantry to pour through. The Luftwaffe attacked major road and rail junctions, and towns and villages were deliberately bombed in order to create a fleeing mass of terror-stricken civilians to block roads and hamper Polish troop movements. The world got its first taste of what became known as the Blitzkrieg. The Polish government pleaded for assistance. 2 days later, Neville Chamberlain accepted that appeasement was no longer an option. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. Hitler's bluff had been caught. One point we have to remember is Hitler does not expect a world war to break out in 1939. He's expecting a limited controlled war to annex Poland. He's surprised when Britain and France actually declare war on him. He doesn't think they'll do this based on what has happened in Munich a year before. Warsaw bravely held out, but after 18 days of continuous bombing, finally surrendered at 2 p.m. on the 27th of September. Germany had gained a swift victory, but Britain and France refused to accept Hitler's peace offer, and Poland had become the first battleground of what would become World War II. Heat.